Something happened on the XRP ledger over the past 30 days that almost no one in the mainstream financial press has properly reported. While retail traders were busy doom-scrolling charts and arguing about short-term price action, $1.5 billion in real-world assets quietly flowed onto the XRP ledger. In that same window, Ethereum bled out $1.2 billion in the opposite direction. That is not a rotation. That is a redirection. And the institutions doing it are not the loud ones on financial television. They are the silent custodians, the tokenization desks, the cross-border settlement teams inside banks you have heard of your entire life. And they are voting with capital that does not move on rumor. Welcome back, channel. If you want the real intel before it filters down to mainstream financial media, make sure you are subscribed and following. Today, we are going to pull apart what is actually happening underneath XRP's price right now, because the gap between the chart and the infrastructure being built behind it has never been wider, and that gap is exactly where generational positioning gets made. Let me start with the macro picture, because nothing in digital assets exists in isolation, and what is happening in the global financial system right now is directly accelerating the institutional migration onto blockchain rails. China's equity markets have been seeing historic capital evaporation, trillions of yuan wiped from valuations in compressed single sessions. Japan's Nikkei has taken some of its sharpest single-day hits in recent memory, with tens of trillions of yen vanishing almost overnight. These are not isolated tremors. They are stress fractures in an interconnected legacy financial architecture that is beginning to reveal just how fragile it really is. When the world's second and third largest economies experience this kind of volatility simultaneously, capital does what capital always does. It looks for certainty, it looks for new infrastructure, and increasingly, that infrastructure is being constructed on blockchain rails. Here is the irony that almost nobody is pricing in correctly. The very instability shaking traditional markets is accelerating institutional migration into digital assets, not the speculative kind, but the utility kind. And that distinction is the entire game. For the better part of a decade, we have lived in a market where price was driven almost entirely by speculation, by narrative, by momentum, by the belief that an asset might one day be useful. But belief is not a balance sheet. A narrative does not settle a cross-border payment. What we are entering now is categorically different. Utility is becoming the price driver, and once utility becomes the price driver, the entire volatility profile of this market changes. Think about what that actually means. Right now, XRP trades at a price shaped largely by sentiment, by macro risk-on and risk-off cycles, by Bitcoin's dominance, by regulatory uncertainty, by the general rotation in and out of speculative assets. That is the world we have lived in. But the world being built right now, the one the Bank for International Settlements is testing, the one JP Morgan and Citi and Bank of America are constructing, the one the DTCC is preparing to go live with, that world prices assets based on demand for their function. That is a completely different equation, and it produces completely different price behavior. Let's talk about the BIS, because this is one of the most underappreciated developments in the entire space. The Bank for International Settlements has been running a proof of concept for international payments using digital currencies, with a specific focus on reducing costs and improving settlement speed across borders. The results have been positive, the framework is advancing, and sitting within that framework as a core partner is Ripple. That is not speculation. That is structural. When you look at the participants in Project Agora, the BIS Cross-Border Payments Initiative, the list reads like a directory of global institutional finance: Deutsche Bank, Bank of England, Banco Santander, Standard Chartered, BBVA, SBI, SWIFT itself, Bank of America, MasterCard. These are not fringe players experimenting with blockchain out of curiosity. These are the foundational pillars of the global financial system, and many of them carry direct or indirect relationships with Ripple. That web is not just growing, it is deepening with every quarter. This is the macro framing everything else hangs from. The infrastructure is being built, the partnerships are being formalized, the proofs of concept are graduating into production. What we are watching in real time is the architecture of a new financial system being laid beneath the surface, while most of the market is still arguing about candles. Now let me get specific about what is happening at the institutional layer, because the announcements stacking up right now are striking in both their scale and their direction. JP Morgan, Citi, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo are reportedly building tokenized deposit networks targeted for 2027. The stated motivation is clear. They need to respond to the growing threat of stablecoin migration. As regulated stablecoins begin to move real value across borders at near zero cost, the incumbent banks understand that if they do not build equivalent infrastructure, they lose the settlement layer. And they are not going to let that happen. There is an important technical distinction worth pausing on. A tokenized deposit and a stablecoin are not the same thing. A stablecoin is a direct digital issuance of a dollar-equivalent asset. A tokenized deposit is, in essence, a digital representation of an existing bank liability that operates within the existing regulatory framework for deposits. The regulatory treatment differs, the issuance mechanics differ, but the functional result is identical. Real financial value moving on digital rails in real time. And for the XRP ledger, which is engineered to settle and clear exactly this kind of value transfer at high speed and microscopic cost, this development is enormous. Here is what ties it all together. JP Morgan, Citi, and Bank of America are already working with Ripple in various capacities. Wells Fargo may not have a direct disclosed relationship, but every one of these banks works with the DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, which clears and settles treasuries through its subsidiary FICC. And as of this year, Ripple Prime is a tokenization service participant for the DTCC. That connection is not indirect. That connection is structural. When the DTCC goes live with its 50-plus firm tokenization initiative, Ripple Prime is in the room. When $114 trillion of assets begins moving through tokenized infrastructure, Ripple has a seat at the clearing table. And that number, $114 trillion, deserves its own moment of reflection. In a matter of months, $114 trillion in assets is scheduled to begin tokenization through the DTCC framework. This is not a pilot. This is not a sandbox. This is the opening of the floodgates. And when that much value begins moving through tokenized rails, demand for a fast, scalable, institutionally trusted settlement layer does not grow linearly. It grows exponentially. The XRP ledger is positioned to be that layer. Let me bring this back to the ledger's own data, because the on-chain numbers are telling a story that should be on the front page of every financial publication, and yet it is not. $1.5 billion in real-world asset inflows on the XRP ledger in a single month. $1.2 billion in outflows from Ethereum in the same period. Ethereum still has a larger RWA market overall. It had a head start and significant developer mindshare, but growth rate is everything in markets. And the growth rate on the XRP ledger right now is outpacing it decisively. What this tells us is that the institutions doing the actual work of tokenizing real-world assets, the firms handling repos, money market funds, structured credit, trade finance, are increasingly choosing the XRP ledger as their settlement and issuance layer. Not because of marketing, not because of speculation, because the infrastructure works, the speed is there, the cost is negligible, and the regulatory clarity around Ripple is improving faster than around almost any other major project in the space. If you are still with me at this point, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with the word utility. I want to see how many of you are actually paying attention to the structural story rather than just chasing price. This is the audience that gets positioned early, and I want to know who is in the room. Now let's talk about Ripple's own roadmap, because David Schwartz, Ripple's CTO, has been refreshingly specific about where the XRP ledger is heading in terms of functional role. He did not speak in abstractions. He named the verticals: tokenized stocks, money market funds, repurchase agreements, on-chain loans. These are not future possibilities. These are active use cases being built and deployed on the network right now. And when you add the total addressable market across just those four categories, the number you arrive at is $176.9 trillion. Tokenized stocks alone represent a $154 trillion opportunity. Money market funds add another $7.9 trillion. Repos contribute roughly $12 trillion. On-chain tokenized loans, currently sitting around $3 trillion, round out the picture. $176.9 trillion in addressable market for the asset categories Ripple's own CTO has explicitly named as targets for the XRP ledger. Let me be intellectually honest about what a number like that implies. Nobody is suggesting the XRP ledger captures 100% of $176.9 trillion. That is not how markets work. But it is worth understanding what full capture would mathematically look like, because it establishes the upper boundary of the opportunity. If the XRP ledger were to settle the entirety of that addressable market at current circulating supply, you arrive at a price of approximately $2,851 per XRP. Using total supply rather than circulating, that figure compresses to roughly $1,769. And if you factor in velocity, if that value turns over 10 times per year, as a settlement asset naturally would, the implied price drops to somewhere around $285 per XRP. Here's the point. Whether the answer is $285, $1,769, or $2,851, any one of those outcomes represents a transformation of wealth for long-term holders. And the velocity argument is actually the more intellectually rigorous framing, because XRP was never designed to simply sit and hold value. It was engineered to move value. Settlement assets derive their utility from velocity, and velocity in a multi-trillion-dollar tokenized economy would be extraordinary. Even 10% capture implies a price measured in the hundreds of dollars. 5% is still a generational outcome. The question is never whether all of it gets captured. The question is what percentage and over what timeline. Now let's talk about where Ripple fits inside the institutional architecture, because this is not just about the XRP ledger as an open network. Ripple has been systematically building what amounts to a one-stop institutional infrastructure stack: custody, payments, on-chain settlement, liquidity, all of it sitting within a single ecosystem. Ripple Prime, formerly Hidden Road, now holds the licenses necessary to clear and settle institutional over-the-counter transactions across dozens of digital assets, including XRP. US-based institutional clients can execute spot OTC transactions through that infrastructure right now. This is not future state, this is live. And the DTCC has been equally direct. When tokenization goes live, it is not an experiment. These are real trades, real shares, real cash moving across real rails. That is the language of implementation, not exploration. What Ripple Prime provides within that framework is the institutional-grade execution layer, the counterparty that can take the other side of a transaction, settle it cleanly, and do so at speed and scale. Mike Higgins from Ripple Prime articulated the next frontier when he spoke about cross-margin collateral, the expansion of an institutional system where Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP, stablecoins, and tokenized money market funds can all be used as margin and settlement assets simultaneously. This represents a structural deepening of XRP's role in the financial system. As tokenization expands the universe of assets with a digital representation, the demand for a liquid, trusted bridge asset to pair against those tokenized instruments grows proportionally. Liquidity begets liquidity. The deeper the tokenized ecosystem becomes, the more essential a high-velocity settlement asset becomes. And XRP is the most logically positioned asset in the world to fill that role. This is the angle that separates XRP from every other asset in the digital space. It is not just that XRP can be used for payments. It is that XRP sits at the intersection of payments, settlement, collateral, and tokenized asset infrastructure all at once. No other digital asset has been architected with that specific convergence in mind. And no other digital asset has the institutional relationships Ripple has spent 14 years building. On the regulatory side, the picture is clarifying in ways that matter enormously. The market structure legislation, the Clarity Act, is moving forward. Fed master account access for crypto-native institutions is under active discussion. A national bank charter for Ripple remains a significant potential catalyst. Each of these milestones, when they arrive, does not simply add legitimacy to XRP. They remove the final friction standing between institutional capital that wants exposure and the asset that was built to provide it. We have seen this dynamic in traditional finance many times. The moment regulatory clarity arrives, whether through a new SEC rule, a chartered institution framework, or a legislative authorization, capital that has been sitting on the sideline moves with speed and conviction. There is a wall of institutional capital that has been waiting for clarity on digital assets, not because they doubt the technology, but because they are legally required to wait. The moment that legal overhang lifts, the rotation begins. And XRP, with its deep institutional relationships and its purpose-built settlement infrastructure, is the natural first mover in that rotation. Bring this to the short-term picture and you can feel the dissonance. Global equity markets are under pressure. Asian markets are in significant drawdown. Bitcoin is hovering at a level that suggests the broader market has not yet found its footing. XRP has corrected meaningfully from its 2025 highs, down roughly 71%, around 350 days into a bearish cycle. Historically, XRP bear markets have lasted between 400 and 790 days, with drawdowns of 85 to 96%. By that measure, we are not at the end of a bear market. We are somewhere in the middle of one. The duration appears to be compressing relative to prior cycles, but the historical framing still suggests pain has not fully cleared. Here is what that historical framing misses entirely. Those prior cycles existed inside a purely speculative pricing regime. The next cycle will not. When utility, real, on-chain, institutionally driven utility, becomes the price driver, the retracement patterns that defined every prior XRP bear market become structurally less relevant. A 24/7, 365-day demand signal from institutions settling real transactions does not permit 90% drawdowns. The demand flow is different. The liquidity profile is different. The price behavior will be different. This is perhaps the most important insight in the entire conversation. We are about to transition from a market where price is a function of sentiment to a market where price is a function of utility demand. Those are fundamentally different regimes. And the people who understand that distinction before it becomes consensus, who accumulate before the utility era is fully priced in, are the ones who will capture the majority of the upside. Consider what Evernorth's Ashish Birla, formerly of Ripple, has explicitly stated in their public communications. Net proceeds from their capital raises will primarily fund open market purchases of XRP to build what they describe as the world's leading institutional XRP treasury. Open market purchases, off retail exchanges, at scale. This is the supply shock thesis made explicit. As institutional demand for XRP grows, as settlement needs expand, as collateral requirements deepen, as tokenized asset volumes increase, the available supply of XRP on retail exchanges gets absorbed. The float shrinks. And when a fixed supply asset with growing institutional demand experiences a shrinking float, the price arithmetic is not complicated. This is the chain of logic that makes the long-term outlook for XRP so compelling. The addressable market is $176 trillion and growing. The institutional infrastructure is being built and connected in real time. The regulatory environment is clarifying. The DTCC tokenization initiative is moving toward live operation. Ripple Prime sits inside that infrastructure as a licensed, active participant. Institutional buyers are beginning to accumulate on the open market. And utility, for the first time in the history of digital assets, is about to become the dominant price driver. We have never seen a market driven by utility in this space. Sit with that for a moment. Every price cycle we have ever lived through has been speculative. The utility era is uncharted territory, which means the price models, the retracement patterns, the cycle timing that analysts have used for a decade, all of it needs to be recalibrated. The playbook is being rewritten in real time. The final insight is simple, but worth letting it land properly. XRP, at its current price, is being valued as a speculative asset in an uncertain regulatory environment. XRP in a world where $114 trillion is tokenized through the DTCC, where Ripple Prime is the institutional clearing layer, where the Clarity Act has passed, where the Fed master account is live, where real-world asset inflows are accelerating month after month. That is a different asset, in a different market, with a different price. The gap between where we are and where this is going is not a gap of belief. It is a gap of time. And time, for those who are positioned and patient, is simply the cost of entry. The institutions are not waiting for permission anymore. They are already inside the building. The only question left is whether you noticed before the doors closed behind them. I will see you in the next one.